What's the mission now? The chaos at the gates of Kabul airport as Western powers scrambling to save those who directly helped them these past 20 years. We're going to be asking about the challenge there. And what about once that last military transport has airlifted out? After ousting the Taliban who harbored Ossama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, there were many objectives over 2 decades. The U.S. and its allies talked of nation building, support for civil society, training for defense forces whose true capabilities, it turns out, proved grossly overestimated. If after 20 years the West failed to win the peace, then what role now going forward? After the fall of Kabul, is it to negotiate with the victors or to fight them some more? Is it to keep regional rivals in check as part of some zero-sum game, or work together to limit the damage? Most importantly, what do ordinary Afghans want? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Afghanistan's race against time, if you will. Joining us, retired diplomat Jean-Yves Berthaud, former French envoy to Kabul, and the author of Lunch with the Taliban, Déjeuner avec les Talibans, published in French the start of next month. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
I want to also welcome France 24 correspondent Margot Ben, who hopes to shuttle out in the days to come. We'll see. From Kabul, Haroon, an Afghan citizen among those trying to get out of there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
And from Newport, Rhode Island, Jacqueline Hazelton, associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College, the author of Bullets Not Ballots, Success in Counterinsurgency Warfare. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, the rotations out of Kabul continuing this Monday at Torrejon Air Base just outside of Madrid. The defense minister on hand to welcome 177 Afghan refugees from this flight. Similar stories throughout the globe. The rotations continue, but it's still chaos in Kabul. We had reported earlier of one Afghan National Army soldier killed in a firefight outside the airport. There's talk of extending that August 31st evacuation deadline, an idea that's been rejected by a Taliban spokesperson. We'll hear from him in a while. But first, let's cross to the Afghan capital. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent is there. Still chaotic scenes at the airport. In town, different story.
Yes, that's right. 2 very different scenes indeed, Francois. All around the airport, there are crowds of people, thousands of people, as we've seen for days, gathering there in the hope of making it through and getting on board one of those military flights out. A lot of the people there, it seems, are turning up just out of hope. They're people from Kabul and from other parts of the country who were displaced when fighting took place earlier, a few months ago, a few weeks ago, when the Taliban took their towns and cities and have been sheltering in parks in the capital ever since. And so they say they're desperate, that they haven't really had enough food, water, and basic things to survive. So they're gathering near the airport. The Taliban is trying to keep them away, trying to do crowd control. You know, we saw them whipping people, repeatedly, firing shots in the air. Very chaotic scenes indeed. And then there's reports of a firefight as well this Monday. So very, very difficult scenes there. The soldiers are really struggling with the crowd control in the searing temperatures. And they're struggling to get people who've had their paperwork approved through to the airbase. So they've now started chartering buses and kind of trying to get them through town, through the Taliban checkpoints, kind of make agreements to do that and get them through military gates in the airport. So it's a very, very complicated logistical situation. And in town, it's a whole other story. As soon as you're outside the airport...
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying in town, Francois, it's a totally different story. As soon as you're out of the airport, it's Taliban land. So they are very visible on the streets at checkpoints all around the former green zone. They are now in control at the US Embassy, you name it, all of the embassy buildings. They are stationed at regular posts. They also have patrol cars going around the city, keeping a very close eye on what's going on. And you've got these very confident heavily armed young men who are no doubt ruling the roost. People are back on the streets somewhat. We're told it's not as busy as usual. You know, there's people out in the shops buying food, mostly men, it has to be said. There are women on the streets, but markedly fewer than in normal times, local people tell us. So they're getting their provisions, but they're also having problems in terms of cash flow because the banks have been closed ever since the Taliban took Kabul, and people are running out of money. It seems money transfers aren't working. So things are calm for now, but it's getting uneasy for a lot of people in terms of their daily life.
And just very briefly, Catherine, this idea of an August 31st deadline, I know it's going to be the big topic at Tuesday's virtual G7 summit. Does it seem realistic?
There are thousands of US and other foreign nationals still believed to be in the Kabul area who haven't managed to be flown out yet. So it's difficult to imagine how those countries can end this evacuation, this military evacuation, leaving those nationals behind. And that's not to mention, of course, all the people who may be vulnerable, who've worked not only with the armies, but of course as translators or in any way working with foreign charities. And there are big questions about what they're going to do and whether the US and its allies can just pull out like that. On the other hand, the Taliban does not seem to let them extend that deadline. So there's very clearly a clash here coming.
All right, many thanks. Reporting live there, Catherine Norris-Trent from Kabul. Yeah, the Taliban rejecting it. A Taliban spokesperson earlier speaking to the Associated Press in Doha. Let's listen.
You can say it's a red line. President Biden announced this agreement that until 31st of August they would withdraw all their military forces. So if they extend it, that means they are extending occupation. While there is no need for that, I think it will deteriorate the relation, that will create mistrust between us. If they are intent on continuing the occupation, so it will provoke a reaction.
Ambassador Berthaud, when you hear those words, is that a little bit of saber rattling, or does that mean there's going to be big trouble after August 31st?
I think it will be complicated indeed, because Taliban like to keep their words. I mean, they have repeatedly said that there were limits. At a point, you know, the limit for the evacuation was scheduled to be on May the 1st, then it was postponed. They expressed anger over that. And now, of course, due to this sudden collapse, it's being extended. Well, they are trying to take advantage of that situation by showing a limit.
And how much weight, I'm very cautious here because this is a spokesperson speaking in Doha. Does he speak for all the Taliban?
Well, for the time being, I think nobody can say that there is any Taliban that can really speak on behalf of the whole apparatus of the Taliban. For a simple reason. You have the Shura of Peshawar, which is in the northwest of Pakistan, and the Shura of Quetta. Most leaders that seem to be emerging are belonging to the Quetta Shura. They just arrived to Kabul, both of them, both of these councils. Shura is a sort of a council of leaders. And we can imagine and figure out really that a struggle for power is going to take place because the Shura of Peshawar is marked by a stronger influence of Pakistan, which means the Pakistani secret services, the ISI, for not naming it, while the Quetta leaders, those that have been emerging very recently, are much more the kind of hardliners that were very much around Mullah Omar, the founder of the movement, the former Amir al-Mu'mineen. So, of course, some of the Quetta people have been talking to the Americans and other Westerners and giving assurances as for the future of Afghanistan, a future that would not be characterized by such hard line as we have witnessed 25 years ago when they were occupying Kabul. But that remains to be confronted between both elements now that they are in Kabul. They had never been in Kabul in the last 25 years. So now they come back, in 20 years, sorry. Now they come back. And of course, they will have to sit around the table and define a line.
Define a line and define who's in charge of what. Haroon, when you hear what's going on, can you tell us a little bit about how that might impact you personally?
Thank you very much. Well, as you know, and the reporter from Inspection gave a very wide and good elaboration of the situation at the airport. With the collapse of government in Afghanistan, not only the government collapsed, with that our hope, our careers, our future, and the achievements of 20 years of the international community efforts collapsed with it. Personally,
Haroon, I'm going to interrupt you because Haroon, unfortunately, I'm going to interrupt you because the line is poor. We're going to try to call you right back and pick up with you. Apologies for that. Margot Ben, your thoughts on this? What happens now now that the rotations are happening? There are more people evacuated this Monday than ever before, so it's starting to gain pace. But this August 31st deadline.
What's sure is that it might be gaining pace, but the disorganization as well. We see many images of evacuations, but what we see a little bit less is that many airplanes have left the tarmac of Kabul airport with very few passengers. Some of them were only half full. Some of them only had a handful of passengers in them. And the reason for that is that there's an enormous amount of people, some of them visa holders or even foreign passport holders, who cannot access the airport. As Catherine was saying, there are thousands of people every day coming to the different gates of Kabul airport, exchanging information on social media, about which one is open, which one is closed, because sometimes close or are easier to access, and so many people cannot actually access the perimeter of the airport.
So right now there's this modus vivendi between those U.S. forces, some of whom had to be called back, and the Taliban. But when you listen there to Ambassador Berthaud describe how we don't quite know who's in charge amongst the Taliban. Well, how do you?
Well, it's actually very interesting because I agree perfectly with Ambassador what Berthaud was saying, and I would just like to add that two things. On one hand, the next days and weeks will be interesting because up to now, in the recent years, the Taliban have tried to show a unified front. They've tried to show that when a leader calls for a ceasefire, for example, everyone respects it. They have tried to show that the political bureau that was in Doha and the Quetta Shura, for example, are unified and speak in the same voice. That was easier back then because they were fighting a common enemy and going towards a same goal. Running a country is a whole different deal. So as Ambassador Berthaud was saying, now will be very interesting to see who will take the lead, who will be in a future Taliban government, who will be included, and that will, probably ask for many negotiations in between the Taliban themselves. I'd also like to add that even though we've been talking about the Taliban leadership and its unification or its divergences, there are also a whole set of Taliban combatants on the ground. Most of these people are teenagers or young adults who have known nothing else than guerrilla warfare and who have been brainwashed into doing this, or who have financial incentives for doing this, or who have simply nothing else and nothing to go back to, no job or no family. These people have been fighting for the past few years, some of them for the past 20 years, and they will behave like members of a guerrilla. They will commit exactions. They will commit human rights violations. And indeed, that is what we are witnessing already today. In the provinces, many human rights violations are being committed. I could go on and on with examples, but many of them have been committed in several provinces around the country. And inside Kabul, even, we see a type of manhunt with Taliban going to individual houses, from house to house, from door to door, looking for people who worked for the previous Afghan government or for the armed forces, or even who worked for international organizations or armies. So already, despite the very polished discourse of the Taliban and of their chiefs who have been living abroad for so many years, the individual Taliban and Taliban commanders in Kabul and around the country, one, are not necessarily receptive to those discourses, and two, some of them are just generally behaving like, war criminals and young members of a guerrilla warfare who are not, listening to their bosses necessarily, and who listen to their individual commanders and the people who they've been taking orders from for the past few years.
Jacqueline Hazelton, your thoughts on, again, this rescue effort?
I think the first thing to note is that this is a massive humanitarian rescue effort, and given the constraints of the situation, including the short fuse on the necessity for beginning it, this is actually going quite well. Things could go bad. I am hoping for the best, but an attack outside the airport gates would be devastating. Bringing down an airliner, especially one full of passengers, would be devastating. But so far, given how difficult it is to mount these evacuations of non-combatants, the military has gotten things into place pretty quickly. An air bridge was already established last week. Something like, I believe, 40,000 people have been evacuated, mostly Afghans. The new problems are going to be aid. There's aid coming into the airport, but the people outside the airport and outside Kabul are in terrible straits. They need aid right away. There's also the question of finding places to permanently resettle evacuated Afghans. They have come into receiving states that have agreed only to take them for the most part temporarily. So where they will go for long-term resettlement is a big question for the future.
The problem with aid, our correspondent Catherine Norris-Trem is also saying that money may run out fast in Kabul.
Yes, that's right. The banks have been closed since, the 14th or the 15th, a little more than a week ago. My understanding is that Western Union, other MoneyGram organizations are also closed down. If you don't have food, if you don't have money, it's very hard to get a hold of basic necessities. And Afghanistan is already an exceedingly poor state. A very high percentage of Afghans live on less than $2 a day. Aid going into the future is going to be a major concern.
Aid going into the future. We will see when we come back, and I believe we have Haroon back on the line. We'll be crossing to him for a first-hand account, especially when you look at that long road, you might say, between the center of town and the airport for the people like him. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate and the race against time to evacuate as many people out of Kabul as possible, airlift them out before an August 31st deadline. There's talk of extending it that will be on the table at a Tuesday virtual G7 summit. We're in the company of retired diplomat Jean-Yves Berthaud, former French envoy to Kabul, and the author of Lunch with the Taliban, which comes out in French in the coming days. Also with us, France 24 correspondent Margot Ben from Kabul. We'll be hearing in a moment from Haroon, an Afghan citizen who is among those trying to leave. And from Newport, Rhode Island, Jacqueline Hazelton, associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College, the author of Bullets Not Ballots, Success in Counterinsurgency Warfare. The chaos which we have amply depicted and described, well, it's got the Biden administration feeling the heat over what many see as too sudden a pullout. Well, on a trip to Singapore, the U.S. vice president earlier was asked about the fall of Kabul.
So I understand and appreciate why you asked the question, and I think there's going to be plenty of time to analyze what has happened and what has taken place in the context of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But right now, we are singularly focused on evacuating American citizens, Afghans who worked with us, and Afghans who are vulnerable, including women and children.
Haroon, what's your reaction when you hear the words of Kamala Harris?
When I hear the words of Ms. Kamala Harris, it's kind of giving hope, but also it also leads us to the challenges. If the evacuations don't happen in the next 7 days, and if the deadline for evacuation is not extended, we are very much afraid that they will prioritize their own military people and their own citizens, and again we will be left behind. As you know, with the collapse of the government, our hopes, our careers, our futures, and achievements of 20 years of the international community and the Afghan government collapsed with it. It's a very unfortunate time. We can characterize this situation as a chaos and tragedy. We have a lot of concerns. First is obviously our lives. For example, for me, it's my family and my life, because I have worked as a senior government official with the Ministry of Interior Affairs, who worked with the international community's efforts, like with RS, with GPPT, with French Embassy, with other embassies, to support the Afghan National Security Forces.
And have you reached out to some of those foreign embassies? Have you got hope of getting on a flight?
I did. Indeed, I have applied. Yes, I have applied. I have emailed the French embassy, because I have worked with. Obviously, I have not directly worked with the French embassy, but I have worked with their efforts. For example, with their security efforts, I have worked with how to deal with their support, because they were supporting gendarmes in Afghanistan, and also with their other efforts, which was more related to cultural and other efforts. Also, I am the founder of an association for the BGF students from France. I'm still the page owner and admin. We have.
Have you heard back from them?
Very limited number of. I have not heard back from any of them. I have emailed like maybe 10 times to many different one of them, but I only heard from one of the diplomats I knew. He said that they are receiving like thousands of the requests for evacuation, and they're not able to handle and reach out to everybody back.
Ambassador Berthaud, let me bring in Ambassador Berthaud here. What advice would you give Haroon?
Well, to continue his efforts in order to present his file. Well, but of course we have to retain that the French embassy at the airport is making a very precise evaluation of every single file that is shown to them. And I suppose that if he does have the credentials for his file to be favorably examined, well, he should have a positive answer.
Haroon, let me ask you a very practical question here. How do you get from the center of town with your family to the airport?
I actually myself went to see and check out the environment there, but as I went there, I was afraid totally. It was very tragic. There were gunshots, and it's like not even, you cannot even say it's a jungle type. It's like there is no rule, there is nothing. Everybody's rushing, and they are putting some kind of gases. The gunshots, people are being killed, people are being beaten. It's totally, you can't imagine like a life like that, you know. It's very tragic situation there. That's why I came back, and I didn't dare to go second time to the airport, because I have a kid, 2-year-old daughter and 5-year-old son, and my wife. We are a family of 4. but like I cannot bear that situation. And even some of my friends who were asked to come to the airport with the emails and everything, they went there, but they couldn't reach in and they couldn't get in. So the situation there is very chaotic, and one fares from, like the kids being beaten, and you have seen the footages. So I didn't dare to go the second time.
Jacqueline Hazelton, let me get your reaction to all of this, because we heard the ordeal there described by Haroon when he just tried to go once to the airport. You said in part one of our discussion that so far the evacuation effort is going as best as it could. You can't help but wonder if this could not have been foreseen beforehand.
This is a question everyone is asking. The problem is there's a very short fuse on getting this operation going. The U.S. military forces that were in Afghanistan before the Afghan National Army collapsed and President Ghani fled were there basically for defensive purposes. They were not there to mount a vast humanitarian rescue operation. The U.S. military is tremendously powerful, but the problem is it cannot change the laws of space and time. It simply takes a certain amount of time to get soldiers and Marines on planes, to get them to Afghanistan or other staging areas outside Afghanistan for receiving refugees. It takes time to arrange. There have been some tactical problems. The State Department sending contradictory messages from Washington on the one hand and the embassy on the other hand. It's been terribly confusing for Afghans, and understandably so, Afghans and others. But I think we have to recognize the size of this effort. 40,000 people, that is a town, a small city.
But hang on, I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Jacqueline, because Margot was with us, it was early July, the last time you were on the show?
Yeah, I believe so.
And, we were wondering then if there would be a Saigon moment.
Well,
we're not that surprised by what's going on.
Well, the thing is that the U.S. retreat has been thought and rethought many times. There have been several, dates set by Trump and then Biden for the retreat. The Taliban have set deadlines. The U.S. retreat is not news, and it has been gradual. So this is not something that suddenly fell upon Afghanistan. And the U.S. Army, the U.S. government have known for some time now that they are leaving. So what many Afghans fail to comprehend, or struggle to comprehend, is how this evacuation program has not been better planned, especially on a wider time frame. For example, many people who hold U.S. and other passports or who have valid visas to go abroad to the U.S. and other countries are currently prevented from going to the airport because there are too many people. It's chaos. It's simply impossible to access it. Could it not have been possible to summon these people little by little for a paced evacuation to happen instead of complete nonsense and chaos and violence happening at the airport? People have died. People have been trampled to death. People have been shot. People's cars have been robbed. The Taliban are shooting in the crowd. I have a friend whose child was injured as they were being summoned by a foreign embassy to the airport. Many other contacts, former colleagues and friends, have been injured and saw people dying in front of them as they were trying to reach embassies who were summoning them. Could this not have been done in a more gradual manner?
Jacqueline Hazelton, I understand that you can't organize a full-scale sort of Berlin airlift, if you will, when Kabul hasn't fallen. Nonetheless, there's been a lot of talk, for instance, of these cases of a lot of red tape from the U.S. State Department preventing those who had visas or were trying to get visas from coming over.
Or reportedly, the U.S. government charging people for seats on evacuation flights. There is a tremendous amount of red tape. I work for the government. I can assure you that the bureaucracy is big and it's powerful and very difficult to cut through. There's absolutely no question. One of the problems that this rescue effort faced was how quickly the Taliban strolled into Kabul. It's simply impossible to predict the exact time of an event, even if you know 70%, 80%, 90% sure that it's going to happen. So that's a problem. There were also a couple of other constraints that I understand to have been in place. One was that Ghani and international aid organizations both urged this administration in the United States not to start evacuating any sooner because they were afraid it would spark a panic and break morale and the collapse would come more quickly. There's another problem that's part of the larger context, which is that the United States has been asking Americans to leave since April and urging others as well to leave since May, I think. So there are a great deal of moving pieces here, and there's absolutely no question the red tape is terrible. But one of the main problems I have with the portrayal of chaos at this point is my understanding is that it is the Taliban that controls the outside perimeter of the airport. And if the Taliban are not keeping the crowds under control, that's a problem the United States simply cannot solve. I have heard about the possibility of the United States trying to extend its perimeter beyond the airport. And I think that could be extremely dangerous unless the Taliban concurred in that decision and participated in it.
So Jean-Yves Berthaud, as a specialist on diplomatic back channels, what is going on, do you think, behind the scenes right now?
Well, in a way, it might be convenient for the new regime to have this confusion so that, first of all, they show their enemy, the United States of America, as not only losing the war, but losing it in a horrible manner, that is leaving this population defenseless at the airport, etc. So in a way, if they gain also a few more days, although they say that it should be the 31st of August, it might be beneficial for them because it will give them more time to manage to reach an agreement upon the line of the new government and who will participate.
Yeah, because there was this statement put out this Monday saying, we're not going to announce a government as long as there are foreign forces in the country. It's convenient, you're saying.
Well, it might be.
Right.
I mean, that's one aspect of it, indeed.
Now, there's, because we're running short on time, and I want to bring up these points, there is, at the same time, in the mix, this area where we are seeing resistance to the Taliban. It's north of the capital, Panjshir. It's a longtime cradle of anti-Taliban resistance. Its leader is the son of the assassinated former leader, Ahmed Massoud, fighting, but he says he's also open to the idea of talking and negotiating.
We've spoken to many countries regarding this issue, that if an inclusive, if a broad-based, and if an acceptable government is going to be established in Kabul, with the presence of all ethnicity of Afghans and all other groups, and together we go to building a new government, then in that case they should support the government. However, if everything is pushed for a totalitarian regime, then in that scenario, in that case, the world should stand with the people of Afghanistan.
So it's a real chess game. What's going on now? How important is this resistance movement in Panjshir? Are we building it up a little too much in the West?
Well, historically, the Panjshir has been a very important stronghold. Its people have been among the most courageous, the most heroic. There's no doubt about it, concerning the time when the Mujahideens were fighting against the Soviets. And then when they were fighting against the Taliban afterwards, Ahmed Shah Massoud, the father of this young man, Ahmed Shah, who was killed
2 days before 9/11.
2 days before 9/11, was very instrumental, and his prestige managed to gather around him a number of commanders from several provinces around Panjshir, on the north of Panjshir.
But you heard Ahmed Massoud there saying, we could perhaps do business with the Taliban.
Yeah, well, because he has no choice in reality. Because what happens is that these provinces surrounding Panjshir, which are the provinces of Badakhshan and Tahar, once upon a time, when they were at war with the Taliban 20 years ago, these provinces were their allies, I mean, the allies of Massoud. Nowadays, the Taliban have very cleverly taken the lessons of history, and they have submitted these provinces in the north of Panjshir, which means that nowadays Panjshir no longer enjoys a capacity of fleeing anywhere or being helped with subsidies or food or whatsoever or ammunitions from anywhere, because they are surrounded by the Taliban. So, of course, it is a very heroic move which is triggering in Europe, in France and elsewhere, a certain emotion and a recognition. But at the same time, one should be realistic and understand that the capacity of this movement to go further is quite limited.
Haroon, is a political solution still possible?
Political solution is obviously possible, and everybody in the world is now also forgetting that a treaty has been signed a few months back with the Taliban and the U.S. government in Doha, and Khalil Zad, who was the envoy of the United States, signed it. And everybody's forgetting that they have power to negotiate, and they could settle the new government in a more peaceful way. That with all the collapse happens like this, it gives Taliban more power, because only Panjshir and few districts in the neighboring province, Baghlan, are in not in Taliban's hands, but overall everywhere else is in Taliban's hands. So they have now more power and for negotiation. So I don't think and even the Ahmad Massoud and the others who are fighting against Taliban, they are not fighting on behalf of the Ghani's government, because he fled himself and he left us behind like that. But still, if they want to have an inclusive government, they have to have people in the government from all the ethnic groups. But it's also very important for Taliban to get recognized as a government from the international community. As you know, Afghanistan cannot afford, Taliban cannot afford Afghanistan's government's expenses without the aid coming from the international community. And if it happens like that, then we are hopeless, and Afghans are concerned that another 20 years of civil war is going to happen with no hope for the Afghans.
So, Margot Ben, do you agree with Haroon there that despite the military pullout, the international community still has leverage because they have the aid money?
I think to some extent, yes. On one hand, it does have the leverage of aid, and we have seen recently that the Taliban are very receptive to that idea. The Taliban have shown, and that is the whole idea of their communication campaign and their kind of new polished face, is that they don't want to go back to mistakes they made in the past and be completely, on the sidelines of the international community. They know that they need aid, and they have shown that they are interested in some kind of international recognition. However, we must remember that international community is not just Europe and the US. The international community is other countries as well. China, the regional economic giant, has shown huge interest in doing business with the Taliban. Taliban leaders have been invited to China. They have conversed with Chinese leaders, etc., about doing business, about building infrastructure and other things in Afghanistan. There are other actors in the region that have been dialoguing with the Taliban for some years now. So I do think that what is sometimes called the international community, but in reality is really Europe and the US and the West, does still have some leverage and is able to pour in a lot of aid that the Afghan population needs and that the Taliban know that their population will need. That is leverage, but it's not everything, and the Taliban are not only at the mercy of international aid and recognition. I do think right now, for instance, right now that the Taliban are in front of all the cameras and they are trying to show a new face, now is the time perhaps to really engage with that and ask them to prove that what they say is true and that they have changed on certain things, not later when Afghanistan will be a little bit less in the headlines.
All right, and there's a virtual G7 summit later this week, important meetings that'll be taking place at the UN Security Council, so a lot more on this still to come. Margot Ben, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Jean-Yves Berthaud. Haroun, best of luck to you and your family. We're thinking of you. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. Jacqueline Hazelton in Newport, Rhode Island, thank you as well. Stay with us. More coverage on our website, by the way, france24.com.